starting to record. Okay. So yes, please, if you have questions that come to your mind as you go through, please stick them in the chat box and we'll try and field them at the appropriate moment. And do ask questions, do make use of the time we have at the end of the session. Right, so hold on. Okay, one moment, and I'll just mute the additional people who need a bit of muting. Right, okie doke. So just to say, this event is part of York Environment Week, which is being organised by various people involved with York Environment Forum. It's our first ever York Environment Week, so very much trying things out and seeing what works. I'd like to say thank you to those who've been key people in getting it together, especially Kate Hignett, whose idea it was in the first place, and Tom de Simone, who's done absolutely fabulous work on the website and all the technical side of things, which the rest of us have no idea how to deal with. So thanks to him for that. So this evening's about From the Housing Design Awards 2013 to York Tomorrow. York has long had a role in innovation in housing. Key examples being New Earswick, the Roundtree village established in the early 1900s with initial designs by Raymond Unwin, and Tang Hall, which was built as homes fit for heroes following the First World War, as what was seen at the time as slums were being cleared across York. More recently, both the Council and the Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust have played roles in ensuring that that process of innovation continues, and we'll hear more of that from our speakers tonight. Philip Crowe, let me just share a picture with you of Philip, which you should now have on screen. So this handsome man here was an architect and illustrator, and he was very much an activist. He established the advocacy group York Tomorrow as part of a successful opposition of the Coppergate 2 proposals from major new development right at the foot of Clifford's Tower. And he also co-founded Tremendous York to further his wishes for massively increasing tree planting in and around York. He was for many years a member of York Environment Forum, a key member of York Environment Forum. He was the long-standing secretary. Sadly, he died in September this year. The photograph is taken in the Guildhall because in 2014, Philip arranged for the display panels from the 2013 National Housing Design Awards to be brought to York and exhibited at the Guildhall for a couple of weeks to raise awareness and to provoke debate about housing quality in the city. Two of the prize-winning architects whose projects formed part of that exhibition were Richard Partington for his development at Derwenthorpe for Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust, and David McHale, who won the Mayor's Housing Design Guide Award for his Church Walk development in Stoke Newington. Since then, Richard has designed further major housing in York, and David has formed architectural practice McHale Riches, which is now designing around 600 new homes in the city for the council's innovative housing delivery programme. So it seemed to me a very good time to ask both Richard and David to say a bit about how they feel housing design has moved on during the past 6 or 7 years. Even before COVID hit and caused all sorts of havoc, it's been an eventful period. There was the gathering pace of response to climate change. There has been frustration with the slow process of house building in the UK. And there has been much discussion about the failures of the planning system, which have led to a current white paper proposing major changes to the regulatory frameworks. So lots has been going on, and hopefully that we can now use to think a bit about how those changes have impacted housing. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And without further ado, ask where this process has led us. So first of all, please, Richard Partington, if you'd like to screen share and start your presentation, and please do introduce yourself briefly. Thank you.
Good. So thank you, Phil. I'm Richard Partington. I'm an architect, and I've been associated with Derwenthorpe and work with Joseph Rowntree for nearly 13 years now, going back to a competition that they organised in 2007 for a small terrace of homes at New Earswick. And I'm really just going to talk about the sort of evolution of design thinking and how particularly views of what we think are good homes and what we value in new homes have evolved, and how to some extent they're represented by Derwenthorpe. But also to talk a little bit about some of the really dramatic changes that have happened in terms of energy policy and approach to low energy design. But I thought it would be helpful really to start much earlier than that with Ebenezer Howard and some of the sort of thinking and some of the social forces that were in play when Joseph and Seabohm Rowntree were thinking about the quality and the needs of houses for working people. And their sort of thinking underpins much of the ethos of Derwenthorpe. So not necessarily the design brief itself, but the general ambition to cherish a sort of sustainability and also the ambition to promote social cohesion and integration. So you might know a bit about Ebenezer Howard. He was a polemicist and an economist more than somebody who was interested in design. But his thinking very much underpinned the Garden City movement, and he's known for a book called Garden Cities of Tomorrow, and this illustration is one of his from that. And Howard basically took a dim view of both city living and country living, and I'll just read a bit from the illustrations, probably too small for you to see, but he describes living in a town as being characterized by fogs and drafts, foul air, murky sky, slums and gin palaces. And he's equally dismissive of living in the country for the kind of lack of drainage, lack of amusement, no public spirit, the need for reform. And Howard's solution really was a kind of ideal blending of the attributes of the countryside and also the facilities and the communality of living in a town. And he proposed this town-country synthesis, which has been misrepresented more recently. And in fact, the whole idea of the Garden City has been reduced down to a sort of suburban dormitory existence, where actually what Howard imagined was something that was really vibrant. And so the two things that were important to him that have been forgotten were that, firstly, the living place should be close to the workplace, that the two should be closely related so that people could travel easily from one to the other. And the second thing that's been completely forgotten is that he really proposed a land ownership model, something like a land trust that gave people access to decent new housing, allowed them to have a stake in it without having to engage with developers or to buy the freehold of land. And Howard's thinking was very, why won't my slides move forward? That's, okay, thank you. Was very influential and very much so in what was built in the early stages at New Iswick, which is what you see here. And New Iswick, of course, was the first project where Parker and Unwin, who went on to design Letchworth Garden City and Hampstead Garden Suburb, first exercised some of their ideas in housing layout and design. And Derwenthorpe, of course, is, because of its position on the edge of the city, in some ways very kind of close to the potential for Garden City thinking. So it's on the edge of the green belt, but it's well enough connected to the city. And with the expansion of the university, it's also really well connected to workplace. So some of the kind of Howardian thinking resonates a little bit in the way that people thought about Derwenthorpe in the early stages. So that's the sort of historical context, but the contemporary context, so thinking about how to deliver homes in sort of 2005, the beginning of the 21st century, and especially how public housing was funded, is absolutely characterized by standards and design guidance and regulations. And in fact, you couldn't build public housing without adhering to this sort of plethora of standards. And I produced this drawing for the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment in 2008, so just before the crash. And you know, there were at that time something like 30 primary standards and 15 secondary standards, all of which were cited within each other or referred to each other or were contained within standards. Standards that were voluntary were contained within bits of planning guidance that were mandatory. And the whole thing was kind of fantastically complicated. And Cabe's idea with this drawing really was to sort of make the case for some simplification and some clarity. And unfortunately, it got picked up by David Cameron, and it was used by the coalition in 2009 and 2010, you know, as a sort of rallying illustration of why modern society was bogged down with bureaucracy and all of this unnecessary, you know, procedural stuff that the Labour government had introduced. My point really, though, is that kind of although all these things are well-meaning and we do need regulations and standards, what tends to happen is everybody designs down to them and they don't really set the context for ambition or creativity or aspiration. And they become a kind of tool for, you know, in that horrible expression, just managing risk rather than promoting ambition. And the brief for the first stages of Derwenthorpe was quite the opposite, really. So it was recognizing that all those standards were in place and that we'd have to comply with them, and that there was this initiative called the Code for Sustainable Homes, which was trying to get everybody in house building moving towards much higher standards of performance and trying to set some benchmarks for quality. But the brief was expressed much more in terms of, you know, making a place that was a really successful place to live. And so we, as a practice, kind of latched onto this really, and we kind of took the view that probably, you know, with the background of projects like BedZ, probably energy shouldn't be the first kind of driving force, that actually a layout and an arrangement of homes that was really conducive to neighborliness and really created an environment where people would immediately be able to get on and feel comfortable and feel at home, that ought to be the starting point. And that kind of chimed with some more thinking in the practice about how you actually go about making a good environmental design. Of course, it comes down to getting the fundamental things in place first. So you don't really jump straight to technology. You kind of think about what are the things that reduce the demand, what are the things that inherently are energy efficient, and how do you build homes that are well insulated and airtight so they naturally and passively keep the energy in or keep heat in. And one of the great things about the competition and the project as it evolved, and it took a long time to get Derwenthorpe off the ground. So it was something like 10 years to get an outline planning application. And then once we'd won the competition, it took another 5 years to get to site. But one of the things that was really extraordinary was that, you know, what we proposed in the competition is pretty much what got built. So it kind of survived all of the sort of toing and froing and the sort of jeopardies of procurement and you know, contractors trying to value engineer things and change them and dilute the quality. And the reason that the project kind of withstood all of that pressure is really because of the sort of strength of personality and conviction of trustees at Joseph Rowntree, key people at York City Council who were the landowner when we first made the first planning applications, and the team that the Rowntree assembled, you know, so people who were advisors, professionals, advocates for good design and for some ambition. And so in this talk, when I say we, I don't mean we as a practice or we as architects, I mean that kind of collective group of people who defended the ambition of the project and saw it through all of the kind of travails of trying to build after a really catastrophic recession. So there's just one more thing to say really in terms of background and what we were doing, because it's another thing that's sort of really not understood about Derwenthorpe or is slightly overlooked. And it goes back to the sort of purpose and mission of the Rowntree Foundation really, and the Housing Trust, which at the time was sort of encapsulated in the words search, demonstrate and influence. And lots of people felt that Rowntree was very good at doing research, policy research, social research. And they had done one or two very small demonstration projects, but the influence part of their mission, they had been very sort of quiet on and hadn't really made an impact on mainstream thinking. And so when it came to the time to decide, how we would build this scheme, there were some really interesting conversations. And the general feeling was that it would be quite straightforward to go and find a local building contractor, a really competent builder to build these fairly unique houses, all one-off bespoke homes. And to do that well and to have a scheme that was successful in terms of construction quality. And probably environmentally as well. But actually that wasn't going to change the way that homes were built in the UK. And it wasn't going to get the major house builders engaged with things like the Code for Sustainable Homes and the Zero Carbon Homes policy. And so we came to the conclusion that actually to make this a scheme that was going to be influential, we had to be engaged with a volume house builder. And so this slightly unholy alliance between Joseph Rowntree and their philanthropic and Quaker background with the sort of, the dark lord of volume house building, Barratt Homes, exactly, Phil, came about. And it's very interesting because what we also, and I mean we being the whole team, kind of collectively decided to do, that the thing to do was to partner with a house builder, not to just sell them land or to ask them to build it with some sort of design and build convention, but to actually set up an agreement where both sides benefited from each other's expertise and each other's background. And neither side was asked to make a massive financial commitment at the beginning. So the land wasn't sold to David Wilson Homes, they built under a license. So basically land was only transferred when private homes were sold and the homes are competed. So Barratt's didn't have to make the big commitment of financing the scheme. And Joseph Rowntree had some influence on the quality and the way that the homes were produced, and also the involvement of their consultants and the people who were advising them. And in, with actually great admiration for Barratt's at the time, and because of the personalities who were involved then, they embraced that wholeheartedly. And they committed to the first phase of the project with extraordinary enthusiasm. And we did our best to set it up for them so that they would do well. So we built some prototype houses, and especially looking at energy performance and whether the homes would deliver what they thought they would in terms of outcomes rather than just design predictions. We did a lot of testing, and we were testing the quality of the details and the construction technology that we were proposing. And we were testing the potential for things to go wrong in terms of wall U values not delivering what we thought they might do, windows not performing as well as they would, ventilation systems not working in the way that we had imagined. And we also devised a construction system that we thought would be fairly foolproof, in the sense that it would allow you to make traditional looking homes, but you could build them in a way where you could see all of the insulation. You could see the standard and quality of the thermal envelope before the external finishes were built up. So the illustration on the right, you can see that silver foil wrapping, which is a reflective material that covers the insulation. That's an indication to somebody doing an inspection on site that all of that insulation is in place and it's completely wrapping the whole of the house before the weathering and the decorative finishes are applied. So we were trying to set the project up so that Barratt would learn about state-of-the-art construction techniques. They would have homes that were getting very close to the highest levels of environmental performance in the code. And we would benefit from their expertise in marketing, in sales, and in managing a supply chain. And of course, Joseph Rowntree being Joseph Rowntree, they did some of the things that are normally left to the end of a project right at the beginning. So the first thing they built was a park, and they invited all of the sort of local neighborhood to participate in the use of that and the play area. And it was connected by a public thoroughfare, which was the Sustrans route. And they also built the infrastructure for the scheme. So the power lines that you can see in this illustration came down and they were undergrounded. And they built an energy centre. So the whole of Derwenthorpe is served by a district heating system. And as part of the energy centre design, which we were responsible for, we sort of, in a kind of slightly clandestine way, snuck in a community room and a teaching space. And the building became very much the centre of a kind of community because it had these communal functions as well as the kind of central energy function. And there's been much discussion, if you know about the history of Derwenthorpe, about the validity of the decision to use district heating and its relevance in terms of low carbon and low energy design. But at the time, you know, there were huge incentives, for instance, the renewable heat incentive. And it's an indication really of how much energy policy has changed in such a short period of time that we're now talking about all electric housing schemes and a decarbonised grid. Whereas when we started Derwenthorpe, you wouldn't have been able to get an electrically heated house through building regulations because of the carbon intensity in electricity. So things have moved very rapidly, and we've been very fortunate because we've been involved for you know, this 13-year period, that we've been able to adapt the designs and adapt some of the technology as time has evolved. And the most recent homes we've built at Derwenthorpe have actually been off the district heating system, and they have been built with a different kind of approach where the solar capacity has been maximized. They're electrically heated through heat pumps, and they're built through a set of conventions that are intended to assure the performance of the homes over the next 30 years. So there's a contract with a separate contractor who's basically underwriting the energy performance. So I've got a few slides now just on really the things that I think worked very well. And looking at those, they're all actually things that people told us not to do. And when I say people, I kind of mean the bureaucrats and the officials and the council type people who really adhered to all that matrix of standards that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. You know, they're the people who kind of need a design guide as a kind of nursing blanket to give them comfort in discussion with designers. And lots of the things that we did are actually things that were going contrary to that kind of received wisdom and that practice. So the first one, and this is an initiative that's been pioneered in York actually, and the council must have credit for that. The first one was to entirely integrate the affordable housing. And Derwenthorpe is pretty much unique, I think, in the country in a private-public partnership of having 40% of the homes are affordable homes. And the homes are scattered around the scheme in an entirely random way. It means you have no idea when you're walking around which is a rented home, which is a shared ownership home, and which is a private home. And an example, say here is in this little part here, white is private, blue is shared ownership, red is a socially rented home. And you see that in practice and with what's built, there's absolutely no differentiation externally. And we did lots of work on trying to devise a range of different types of house. So homes for starter homes, which were big enough for a family to expand into. So a home that wouldn't evict you at the beginning of life. And then homes that were incredibly flexible in terms of adaptation and changes that you could make as you got to later life or infirmity or disability. So what people now call lifetime homes, which was again pioneered by Joseph Rowntree and trialled very much at Derwenthorpe. And we created streets that weren't dominated by cars. So this was a kind of European idea of kind of making home zones, but specifically identifying parts of the scheme where a car would only venture into it if you needed to make a delivery or drop somebody off. And we treated all the surfaces where vehicles would normally be driving on tarmac with kind of local authority curbs and yellow lining and signage. We did all the way with that entirely. And we just said, look, everybody should just walk on footpaths, and footpaths, should, as you get nearer the home, get progressively more refined and nicer quality. So as you get to the entrance of the door, there's something that celebrates the fact that you've arrived. On the right-hand image, you see the end, there's a little space, a little square at the end of that home zone. And here we put a little park, a little play area. And everybody said, God, you're mad doing that. The play area needs to go on the edge of the scheme and a bit of leftover land. And, it's going to be full of hoodies and asbos. And we did even worse than putting it right in the middle. We put the highest value of the house right next to it, 5 meters away. So the local authority standard said houses needed to be 18 meters away from play areas. And we managed to persuade them to allow us to put a house 5 meters away. And it kind of made absolutely no difference to perceived kind of nuisance. In fact, everybody looks out on this little space because of the way it's designed. It's just a little public square. And there are a series of these dotted around the scheme. And the play is informal play. It's kind of sculptures made in wood and things that you can climb on, stones and rocks. And it's landscaped. It doesn't have railings around because the railings are hidden within hedges. And so the public realm is just a series of kind of nicely considered meeting places that connect all of these walking streets. Again, you can see on the left-hand image, one of the main streets, no curbs, no pavement, no differentiated footpath except in the texture of the materials, and parking and cars incorporated within a kind of public realm that gives pedestrians a priority. So one of the other things we had to do to meet these kind of this kind of raft of standards is that in publicly funded schemes at the time, you were rewarded for building to higher densities and building upwards. So we had a lot of 3-story homes, and it's quite a dense development in some respects. And we'd already discovered in practice that you get these kind of slightly lopsided homes where you get lots of bedroom accommodation on the first floor, and not enough sort of family space on the ground floor, or at least a disproportionately small amount. And so on the townhouses and these taller houses, what we thought would be nice is we'd create a kind of haven at the top of the house where the master bedroom has a really generous ensuite, it has a dressing room, it has a study, and it has this external balcony at the top of the house. And of course, that's proven to be something of a godsend. Firstly, parents or people doing work at home can be detached from the noise of the kind of shared living space on the ground floor. But it's also proven to be something of kind of a refuge now that we're all living with each other, having homeschool and homework and multi-generational living kind of forced on us by some of the circumstances this year. So this is a great one. This is a house that I designed, and it was basically, I just sat down and designed a house that I'd love to have. And it became one of the house types at Derwenthorpe. And we were told by this character called the Secure by Design Officer, again, very well-meaning, wants to reduce crime by designing out the potential for antisocial behavior or threatening behavior. So you don't want to have these setbacks by the entrance. You don't want to have these columns. Somebody mischievous could hide behind them. They're completely kind of reductive view of the world. I think every house needs to have a generous area where, if it's south-facing, where you can sit out the front and say hello to your neighbours, where you can tend your front garden, where if you're arriving with all the shopping, you can put your bags down on a chair and you can find your keys without getting soaking wet. So, some of the things that we kind of know instinctively characterize a really great home are beginning to be kind of filtered out by some of this kind of well-meaning, design by code and design by standard. So one of the ones that was slightly mad, actually, I have to admit, and people said, are you sure about this? And I said, yeah, no, this is a great idea. We've got to do this. So this is on the right-hand side, one of the winter gardens from one of the early phase of homes. And this idea came from various things that were to do with environmental design, capturing free heat on the south side of the home, using the winter garden as a buffer, using it as a space to create privacy. So some homes have their living rooms on the street side because they have lots of glazing on the south side. If they're on the north side of the street, they have lots of south-facing glazing. And the winter garden provides some privacy between the street and the living space. But it also is a kind of response to what people do to their houses. So the most popular upgrade for a house is to put a conservatory on it. And the most disastrous thing you can do to a house, environmental terms, is put a conservatory on it, especially if it's one that you heat with a convector heater and you heat it all winter round because it's a nice place to be. So we persuaded everybody that the winter gardens would be a great thing to do. And of course, it became a battle in the future phases of people saying, well, it doesn't really have a function. You know, Richard, I can't really explain why you've got these two external walls and you've got this space that, you know, some people love because they garden, but some people can't work out what to do with it. And I did my level best to persuade people that actually it had all of these environmental benefits, but that now we need to think about overheating. And we need a device for ventilating homes in a secure way and getting good air movement through them. And of course, I was laughed out of York when, 5 years ago, I was talking about homes overheating and everybody was saying, oh, you know, what I should have done, I guess, is just say, you know, actually, these homes have no purpose whatsoever, but people are going to love them. And that's the best reason for keeping them. So they were a bit of a casualty of value engineering. The things that were retained all the way through the scheme were the quality of the landscape and the external environment. And we just took the view that the landscape was a gift. You know, why wouldn't you do your level best to make best use of it and design around it? So instead of being, you know, seeing trees as being awkward things that, you know, get in the way of your road layout or reduce the density, you make the tree of the focus wherever you can of one of these meeting and resting places. And we also inherited, as part of the original outline plan, some protected landscapes. So what you see here is actually the remnants of a ridge and furrow field. And so that's been incorporated with the Sustrans route, you know, within one of the landscape spaces that the houses overlook. And it's been really, really extraordinary, you know, right from the beginning of lockdown, the number of people who've emailed me or contacted me to say, just, you know, we feel so lucky, we're so fortunate that, you know, we have a home that we really enjoy, but it's also a home that's in this extraordinary landscape, that's in this kind of relief from the pressure of lockdown and being inside. One of the things that's not been so successful, and I think this is an issue in the whole of York really, and David McHale is going to really come up against it in his projects around Bishopsthorpe, is that York still doesn't have the quality of public transport that means that most journeys are automatically more convenient by cycle or by walking or by taking the bus. It has a very draconian policy on housing provision in relation to the number of car parking spaces. So basically trying to reduce the amount of car usage by allocating a small number of cars to each new home. And, you know, it's a really difficult policy to implement in a city that doesn't have enough priority or funds allocated to public transport. And right from the very outset, Derwenthorpe was intended to have a bus route going right through the centre of it. And we even got to the point in 2012 when there was funding agreed, and we'd won public funding for an electric bus, you know, really pioneering innovation. And one way or another, with the kind of private bus franchises, that never happened. So despite having a car club, despite having the Sustrans route, despite being quite close to the university, source of employment, parking is still something of an issue. But it is interesting to hear people say, well, at least we only have one car now. You know, we would have in the past had 2 cars. And we use the car club car for going to the dump, great idea, picking up the bricks from the builder's merchant, you know, hauling the charcoal for the barbecue and things. So beginning to be, I think, a change a little bit in kind of people's expectation that they'd have space for 2 or 3 cars with their home. But Other things to do with public realm and parking went incredibly well. And one of the things that we really benefited from was really progressive attitude from the highways department in York. And people, you know, in design and built environment are always kind of frustrated by highways rules and highways regulations, turning circles for bin lorries and set off distances and verges for, you know, services and things. And York, to their credit, and if you've ever worked outside the city, you'll know how difficult it is. York were absolutely pioneering in buying into this idea that the streets could be shared spaces where basically you walk down the middle of the street, you don't need a designated footpath. And motorists get used to the idea that you're driving through a pedestrian domain. So you drive as if you're driving on a campsite, you know, just expecting kids to be on their bikes, a ball to kind of appear out of nowhere, somebody to be, you know, not expecting a car. So the cars drive very slowly. And one of the reasons why the highways people said, well, we can really understand what you have in mind. So all of the conversations we had with highways were through three-dimensional drawings like the one on the left. So, you know, computer visualizations saying, you know, this is what we imagine it would be like. It's like a kind of street in a village, you know, somewhere in the Vale of York. It's not like an urban environment. And you can see there's a really strong correspondence between what we imagined and what we tried to, you know, describe to other people and what was actually built. And again, that's down to this kind of perseverance really of trustees and the people who were the guardians of the project. A fantastically supportive environment for us to work in.
Are you,
so the
Richard,
final
are you
one,
kind of close to the end of yours, or are you?
very, very close, yeah. So you can imagine the conversations we had about guardrails and water and the health and safety obsessive saying, oh, you know, you can't put a lake in the middle of the scheme. It's sort of a dangerous thing to do and all that kind of stuff. But of course, the lake didn't start life as a lake. It was a SUD scheme, you know, to balance the surface water runoff and not discharge too much water into Osbaldwick Beck. And it was kind of one of our main contributions, that is us as Studio Partington, to say, well, no, this needs to be a central feature of the scheme. It needs to be kind of the defining external landscape feature. And so we made it much shallower and we made the edges very, very gentle. So you can walk quite a long way into it before you're out of your depth. So it's relatively safe for kids. And it became the focus and the kind of center point of both the kind of ecology and all the landscape and public places. So just a few slides to finish off really, to go back to this question of whether we actually influence mainstream practice. And there was a kind of purple period while we were coming to the end on Derwenthorpe, where we were also asked to work for Barratt on several schemes. And this one at Toast Chocolate Works got built. And it was why it was still being built. And it was while there were still some very pioneering and ambitious people in the Barratt organization, all of whom have now moved on. And it was also before the government gave up on any kind of standards for housing and any kind of emphasis on design quality. So by the time the Tories had got re-elected and abandoned their coalition partners, they had really been mugged by the house building industry, who said, we just can't deliver the number of homes we need if we're bogged down with all these environmental standards. Got to stop making progressive changes to building regs. You've got to make the planning system simpler. You've got to let us have free reign to build, and then we'll deliver homes. Of course, that's never been the outcome of all of those changes. But this is probably the last scheme where Barratt really tried to do things that were innovative and imaginative. And this is a project actually that when other people see it, people view Derwenthorpe as having the kind of fantastic patronage of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, but they see Terry's as being rather unique because this was a direct appointment by Barratt with us, and largely they trusted us in a whole kind of area where they didn't really understand what they were doing or what they were building in terms of the innovation in the house types, the quality that we're expecting, the conventions that were broken in terms of sort of density and how you incorporate public space and parking and public realm. And of course, there was this extraordinary historic context. So York planners were also fantastically demanding in terms of the design quality and the layout and the way that houses were organized. And it's organized in a series of terraces that seemingly like Georgian terraces, but actually they're broken up into groups of 4 houses so that we can accommodate the parking more easily. So you get 2 pairs of houses, one with parking underneath in a kind of actually a Barratt townhouse, but adapted, and then a break in the terrace so that you can get some parking at the sides and parking doesn't dominate the scheme. And the house in the middle took what I think was a really miserable house, which had, basically just the ground floor as a parking area, a small kitchen and a stair, and actually made it much more expansive and much more generous. And we introduced this first floor balcony, and we insisted on doing, actually, and York backed us up on this, doing all the working drawings for the scheme and supervising all of the construction all the way through. And Barratt probably built every house twice to get it right. So it was a painful process for them and painful for us. But the execution and this kind of architecture really relies on the quality of the detailing and the quality of the execution is actually of a very high standard. We persuaded them to do all kinds of interesting things. So like this conservatory at the first floor is an extension of a first floor living room. And this house on a corner has one of the larger gardens, but its garage at the end of the garden then has an apartment above it. So we were trying to make a streetscape with pavilions and coach houses rather than just large houses with garages at the end of them on a side street. And you can see the little thumbnail sketch on the left is our conceptual drawing, drawn 4 or 5 years before this was actually executed and delivered on site. Getting them to engage with, building in stone, building this fantastic south-facing colonnade was very difficult. And we had to use all our kind of guile and persuasive ability really to suggest things like, well, on this building, don't build one of your expensive marketing suites. Don't throw all that money at a new building that's only temporary. Why don't we do a building that's a mixed-use building? Put the marketing suite in it on the ground floor, and then in 5 years' time when the scheme's built, that will just change use to become the supermarket or the convenience store. So they went along with all of these kind of suggestions, which for them were kind of right outside their comfort zone. So to kind of come back to kind of things that I value, and these are the kind of things I do when I'm bored in site meetings. I go around and I take photographs of people's front doors. And I think these are the kind of strongest indicators of whether we are creating a neighborhood, whether people feel comfortable and feel that their home is something of a haven and a refuge, but also something that's liberating and empowering. The fact that people leave Wellington boots out and benches, they leave their pots outside the front doors. They've customized all of their door numbers. This little lad at the bottom, I met him down at the Osborne village end of the scheme with my camera taking photographs. He goes, "Oh, mister, can I be in your photographs?" I said, "Well, I'm not sure about that. That's not really what I should be doing, is photographing you, but let's go and talk to your mum. And if she says it's okay to be in a photograph, then that's fine." And this guy raced off on his bike and I followed him on my bike. And it took me about 15 minutes to catch up with him and get to his house. So his family were obviously really confident that he was playing on his bike, such a long way away from where his house was, perfectly safely. And of course, very pleased to then be in the photograph on our website. I haven't done much on the technical stuff, but it's all online. If you go to our website, you can see some of the post-occupancy research, some of the learning from Derwenthorpe that's been published, some of the interesting stuff that York University has revealed about the carbon footprint of York residents. And all of this is accessible together with some of the work we've done on publications about the history of housing. And then a nice little house that we designed 20 years ago, which actually was an all-electric house. So things have this unerring capacity to come around full circle. And I hope we can still learn from Derwenthorpe. It's very sad, I think, that organisations like Barratt haven't been challenged enough to carry on the good work that they started doing. And in a way, they've kind of resorted back to type, and we're wrestling again in government with how do we raise design standards and design quality in the private sector. Hopefully Dave is going to talk to you about what can be done in the public sector, which is a different conversation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Richard. That's excellent. I've certainly got questions. I'm sure other people have too, but I think we should move on to David's presentation now and pick all the questions up at the end of that. So David is with us, hopefully. He's
Now
turned his camera off.
And I need to work out how to stop screen sharing, Phil.
Yes, that's it.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Phil.
Hi, David.
Thanks for inviting me tonight. That's I'm sorry to give you a heart attack earlier.
Excellent. Right, you should be able to screen share now and put your presentation on. And do feel free, please, just to give a brief introduction of yourself, because I've left it to the two of you to say who you are and to tell people what you want them to know.
Yeah. Share a screen. Let's have a look.
And so on.
Desktop. Yeah. Share desktop.
Yep. Brilliant.
Yeah. Can you see that?
Yeah.
If I go full screen. There we are. So Phil, yeah, thanks. I'm David Mikhail, founding director of Mikhail Riches. We're architects with a focus on housing, both local authority and private. I'm just conscious of time. I've been told I've got 20 minutes. I've got 60 slides, so I better rattle on. I just wanted to pay homage, first of all, to Phil, and I know that he introduced us to York via the Housing Design Awards and with a focus on our scheme for Church Walk. So I'm going to talk about that before moving on to Goldsmith Street, some of the learning that went into Goldsmith Street from previous projects, and then finally a lens on the work we're doing with York City Council, if that sounds okay. Right, so back in 2004, I think, I got an email saying there was this site down the road and it was up for auction, and good news, because I've been looking for a site for a long time, and the bad news was I had 3 days to go before the auction. It came with a planning permission for 2 houses and a bungalow. It was also massively overlooked from a building at the back. As you can see, living rooms looking over the site. And if you look at the site plan in red, site boundary, it's very, very close to that building I've just shown you, about 1 meter away in the one corner. And when I popped my head over the hoarding, this is what I saw. We were lucky enough to win it, though, mainly because it was so badly overlooked and such a hideous site that I don't think it got many bids. That was a very cheap carver, I hasten to add. And the scheme we did for it on our kitchen table, Annalie and I, and made of cardboard, was all about trying to optimize a very tight 22 meter by 11 meter site in such a way that we avoided those windows overlooking at the rear. And the strategy for that in plan was this. So the street is to the bottom of the page, and to the top is our neighbor, which was at a kind of 45-degree angle to what is predominantly a rectangular site. And so we evolved this kind of technique, this geometric technique for a kind of tessellated plan with solid walls presented to the neighbors, allowing perpendicular windows which avoided overlooking and being overlooked, and also enjoyed long views out. And as built, that's pretty much what we've done. And that tessellation appears in the building in various ways, with little triangular roof lights on the ground floor at the back. Everything was very, very heavily scrutinized by the planners because there was a lot of objections from neighbors. This was our pre-computer decade rights of light and BRE daylighting guide, which was all done with a bit of cellophane and some pens. And what it really told us was that there were a number of vertices in space that we had to stay within to avoid injuring our neighbor and injuring his or her light level. So actually a very strong response to neighborliness is, I think, what characterizes this building. So optimizing a difficult site. So the building goes all the way down to 2 meters above ground floor level in that very difficult corner, all the way up to 4 stories at the other corner. And internally, I don't have time to dwell on the plans and the sections, but all the living spaces and dining areas have double height spaces with triangular roof lights. Bedrooms tend to be on the ground floor, so they're upside down houses and flats. And that last one, which you see Anneli pushing Ridley into our son, is a kind of 4-story flat with its own front door. But what this project had was a series of front doors onto the street and some very difficult relationships which we wouldn't usually dream of, but which the site itself kind of enforced on us, such as bedrooms onto the ground floor, onto the street. And so how we dealt with that was some very unusual sliding security screens which allow light and views in and out, but in a very controlled way. So there's a sliding security gate which gives you a view right through to the back garden, and from the inside this 3mm aluminium mesh allows views out and light in such a way that you can manage privacy because of the strand orientation of it. So I'd say this project was incredibly bespoke, and it was lucky enough, we were thrilled that it picked up the Housing Design Award, the Mayor's Award, in fact, for that year. And I think Philip would have drawn your attention to it when you talked about the Housing Design Awards that year. And I think it's part of the work that the practice has done, which has been about, you know, domestic space, one-off houses, extensions to people's houses, thinking about what makes a great home. What doesn't make a great home is the kind of what we've come to realize is what doesn't make, and a lot of others do too, is homes and places that are orientated around cars. And you know, everybody probably knows the Levittown in New York kind of setting on the left and all the lessons we can draw from that. But on the right is a plan of a site that's only just recently got permission and has been promoted by Homes England, the government's own agents, for accelerated house building. And it looks as if we haven't learnt many lessons if you look at this. And you know, this is the enemy as far as we're concerned. This is the edges of most towns and cities in the country at the moment. If you look at that, there's a whole analysis that goes with the slide. I don't have time to show you, but essentially there is no communal green space. There are probably 1 or 2 trees. Everything is dominated by tarmac and parking courts. So with that in mind, I want to talk a bit about Goldsmith Street and how we got there. In 2005, again, we were very, very thrilled to win our IBA competition for housing in a village called Elmswell in Suffolk. This is it, 28 homes for a local housing association. Very, very deep green in its construction, so very low embodied carbon, using sprayed hempcrete into a prefabricated timber frame. There they are, gunning it in. They had, unfortunately, there were some teething problems on site, as with all innovations. We had to swallow our pride and get the specialist over from France to help us, but it all came good in the end. The site itself, we arranged in such a way that significant public space is enjoyed in and around the site. There's a small children's play area under apple and pear trees in the middle. And so there are some nice social ideas here about the importance of children's play, allotments and a wildflower meadow and a football pitch as being the kind of glue by which a community may form. And here's a small children's play area overlooked by kitchen windows. Parents tend to gather around the edge of the picket fence, watching their children playing, having a chat. It's really lovely. It's a lovely place, but it was a very early project for us, and there was lots of learning. Some of the things we embedded in the scheme worked well, and some things didn't work so well. I think the district heating system, which was biomass, as Richard has said, enjoyed quite a lot of encouragement at the time, for lots of good reasons for it. Very low carbon, local fuel. Thetford Forest was supplying it. Didn't work very well. But what was really great was Borough Happold, who were the sustainability engineers for this project, employed one of their team at PhD level to do a 2-year post-occupancy analysis. And it's a fascinating read. I can't really talk about that tonight, but one thing we came away thinking was that if there's one thing we can do which works, which really does bring benefits to residents, it's to face as many of the properties south as we possibly can and to harness the winter sun. Because whilst a lot of the sustainability benefits were, when measured, were quite questionable, the one thing that did work really well with this scheme was the fact that we'd orientated every house to face south, and the section, which I haven't talked about, I'm sorry, the section through the properties was all about managing that low winter sun so it penetrated into south-facing rooms. So we come to Goldsmith Street, and again, an RIBA competition, I think 2008 and 2009, around the end of the year. The brief here was fabulous. It talked about a place that would be connected for cyclists and pedestrians, a place where families and every generation could enjoy. 10 minutes walk away from the city centre. There you see it in the red dotted outline. And it was an aspirational brief by by Norwich City Council for a very important site as far as they were concerned. It had history. They really wanted to make this an exemplar project. And the brief was inspiring enough, but actually one of the challenges of the brief was a density of about 100 homes per hectare. That was, we believe, sustainable because it's a 10-minute walk away from the centre. And however, when we looked at trying to marry both providing that level of density with family homes and houses, we couldn't really see a way to do it initially. And a lot of tracing paper was used up before. In fact, I can remember we had 2 or 3 schemes and a couple of crits with friends of ours, and we had to bin a number of schemes before we alighted on the understanding really that perhaps the best model was local, that about 5 minutes walk away from the site is an area known locally and very affectionately as the Golden and Silver Triangles. And these are the kind of houses that we find there. It's terraced housing. You find it up and down the country, really. It's not particularly remarkable or particular to Norwich, but it's Victorian, Edwardian terraced housing, front gardens, back gardens, on-street parking. And when we looked a bit more closely, we discovered that both the backs and the fronts were separated by 14 meters, which of course, as I'm sure most of you know, flies in the face of most planning guidance, which generally talks about the magical 21-meter overlooking distance. So this is Portland Street and Dover Street in Norwich. So we applied 2 things to the site at Goldsmith Street. We applied the learning from Clayfield, which was to try as hard as possible to deliver a solar scheme facing south, harnessing low winter sun, but also to look at 14-meter wide separations between properties. And this is a axonometric which shows the kind of layout of the master plan, which respects a series of terraces which face south, streets separated by a 14-meter separation, and back elevations as well. In section, you can see there very clearly that the separation between terraces is 14 meters, garden and street. The roofs, like Clayfield, a different typology, but the roofs here again are modeled very carefully with very low eaves levels on the north side to ensure that the low winter sun is harnessed. When it comes to the site arrangement, the terraces have been arranged in such a way as to make sure that back gardens face existing back gardens, that wherever possible, streets and front doors are onto and connected to existing streets. So to achieve this site layout, we had to drill right down and invent new housing types, which would lend themselves to exactly this 14-meter separation. A bit more detail here, you see a number of external spaces which are very important to the success of the scheme as well. So I'd like to stress that I think the success of Goldsmith Street is partially about its environmental response, its low carbon agenda through Passive House, and to an extent through low carbon materials. But I think for us as a practice, one of the most important aspects of it is the social ideas behind public space. I don't know if you can see my cursor, Phil. Yeah. To the right is a small children's play area, which connects to an existing church and a footpath through to the wider area. This here is a pair of existing and lovely catalpa trees, which forms the kind of focus of the whole scheme. The streets themselves are seen very much as public space with on-street car parking, street trees, etc. There's also a series of connecting alleys or ginnels between back gardens, which allow for access for bin stores and bike stores. So your bins are held at the end communally here. And what we've done is we've slightly exaggerated the alleyway or the ginnel to make it more of a place. So it's meant to be, and I think it is, a place for children to play, but also for adults to meet. That's a typical street, and in it you're looking at on the left are the south-entered, south-facing front gardens and front doors of one of the terraces. To the right-hand side, you're looking at the north-entered houses. And so to the left, the houses have front gardens. To the right, on the north side, they have that situation you find in many streets up and down the UK with windows, living room windows directly onto the street. In this case, separated by a 300mm planting zone. That's more of the south-facing gardens, bin stores, and meter cupboards very carefully designed out so you don't really see them. And that's a view right down the center of the scheme with your back to the south. So you're looking north. And what you're seeing on the right-hand side is the catalpa that I mentioned earlier. And the bigger 3-story buildings which face onto this kind of square are the flatted end blocks. And there they are again at the other end of the terraces, this time looking down Goldsmith Street itself. And this is that central shared space which the expanded aluminium doors of bin stores and meter cupboards kind of hide the back gardens, and you can just glimpse through here the secure gate to the ginnels. And children tend to just kind of roam through these ginnel spaces out into the public space in their scooters. That's one of the ginnels. So, it's not enormous, but it has a huge impact on, I think, the lives of residents. One of the residents who's not got children did call it Kidmageddon, which I quite liked. She had a wry smile on her face when she said it. And the facades of the street, the front doors, each front door is a different color. boring, isn't it? You know, it's rectangular windows and a roof and a brick wall and, you know, front gardens. Really simple stuff in a way. There's no architectural gymnastics, but what there are is a very careful, and I'm sure any of you that have dealt with passive house principles know, a very careful iterative process of testing and retesting the exact size of the windows, the exact amount of cold bridging were allowed, therefore, you know, the number of doors were allowed in the scheme. So, you know, even so, we spent a lot of time trying to make sure that the architecture, rather than the passive house principles, which we were signed up to achieve, were as much in the process. So as passive house. So I should say everything is 100% certified passive house here. But equally important to us was that you didn't see boiler flues on the street. And you know, that you didn't see gas meters and you didn't see kind of bin store doors hanging off their hinges like you so often see on projects after 2 or 3 years. So all the public realm stuff and even the semi-public realm stuff like front gates, bin store doors, meter cupboards, they're all really carefully thought through. So the passive house principles which you see here are just part of the story. This is the drawing really, and it shows the typical house section with its low eaves to the north and the facade to the south, both encouraging warming winter sun in the winter, but through brise soleil protection, ensuring that they don't overheat in the summer. The blue shows the kind of depth of wall and roof construction, 600 millimeters, 2 feet in old money, very well insulated fabric. The red is the air tightness layer. And number 5 shows you what they all have, which is a very, very high performance whole house ventilation system by a company called Paul, and very high quality ducting with acoustic baffles and all the rest of it. We were absolutely desperate to make these houses work for people inside as well as out. So the quality of the kit in here is first rate. And we got advice from the Green Building Store that had a lot of experience putting right installations, whole house ventilation systems around the country that they'd had to put right that had gone wrong. So we benefited from their learning, both in terms of spec and installation. What does passive house mean for the kind of fabric? Well, you know, it has to be very, the air tightness has to be very carefully controlled. But architecturally, you're dealing with very thick walls, as we were, because we wanted, and the client wanted, a very low carbon, non-petroleum based insulation. We used recycled newspaper blown into a timber frame with a brick cladding, which was all about the robustness at street level. We ended up with 600 mil, 2 foot thick walls. So what you're looking at on the right is the windows and the kind of coffered, profiled modeling of the windows is partially about making the windows look larger from the outside than they really are, because passive house wouldn't let us have them any larger. Too much heat gain in the summer and too much heat loss in the winter. So it's a kind of trick, if you like, to make the facades look a bit more generous. So the eyes on the face are larger. But it's also that coffering is also inside out, not making the windows look too much like a kind of castle wall and too depressing, if you like, from the inside. Here's an elevation of a typical street, series of houses, different coloured front doors. At the end on the left, you see the flatted blocks, each one a one bedroom flat, each one either with a garden at the back on the ground floor or a south-facing roof terrace on the first and second floor. More details. Materials. Top left shows the glossy black pan tiles, which we were delighted to use. They're very much a Norwich thing. And when they came back, significantly cheaper than the cost plan allowance for zinc, we were absolutely thrilled. My project architect, James, wasn't thrilled. He'd done all the details in zinc, but that's another story. these are houses where you walk directly into the kitchen dining room off the street, off your front garden, or in this case, this is a south-entered house. Again, a typology we've known and loved and lived in ourselves up and down the country. You know, it took some courage from our client, but they went for it. And I think the benefit is a super wide house, 6 meters, not very deep, I think 8 meters depth. So 6 meters by 8 makes for a very light, bright home. And it had to be that dimension to get the 14-meter distance overlooking streets, etc. So the house type is a function of the master plan rather than the kind of house builder model where you've got your house types and you just chuck them like kind of monopoly, plastic monopoly houses on the site. This is a very different approach. 2 bedrooms on the top floor, again looking south, and you can see for the eagle-eyed amongst you that the very low eaves on the north side mean a very low ceiling height over that that bathroom at the back. And also it's actually 1.7, so you can still stand up. Most people can stand up here for a home working space at the back of that landing, which is very much used, I should say. The north-entered houses, slightly different. You walk into straight off the street into a hallway. But then your kitchen dining room is again facing south over your private garden. These are the north-entered houses. And you know, that slightly uncomfortable situation of a living room or a kitchen window at street level with no defensible space other than a 300 planting strip felt like a bit of a risk. But actually, in reality, with some, plantation shutters as part of the architectural spec on the inside and a bit of planting, actually, it feels great. It feels like a Victorian street does. The flats are, I'm really proud of. They're the conundrum of how do you make a flat feel like a house? And I'd had experience in living in a flat where I'd walk straight up to a first floor from the front door. And we wanted to bring that to both the first floor and the second floor flats. And I think it was Annalie that came up with this idea of the scissor stair. So the flats each enjoy their own front door pavement. So once you put your key in that lock, that's yours. You know, that pram space by the stair or that space for loads of shoes or a bike, you know, that's as true to you on the top floor as it is on the ground floor. So the color coding is yellow top floor, blue middle floor, brown ground floor. The ground floor flat is M43. And Norwich found that they had a real need for 1-bedroom flats. These were originally 2-bed, but the bedroom tax came in whilst we were building this and or designing it, and they really felt the need for lots of 1-bedroom flats, which is not what you often hear, is it? So here's a view of the flat. So 3 front doors, all at street level. I think this is an example of how front doors help to animate a streetscape, as do well-used balconies, which these are. So what's happened after Goldsmith Street? Well, we are beside ourselves to be working in York. It's the most exciting, I think, the most exciting set of schemes we have on our books. Not only do the City of York want to emulate Goldsmith Street, but they want to do better. They want zero carbon where possible. And they want us to also target or at least report on the embodied carbon in construction. There's a great, very joined up housing design program manifesto, if you like, which sets out the aspirations of the team and the city. And I'm going to run out of time to talk about it in any detail, but here are a few examples. This is Duncan Barracks. This is Burnholme near Richard's scheme. And I think, and this is an early sketch of the Ordnance Lane site. So we're looking at 3 sites at the moment. all with very similar DNA, but each one different depending on its locality and what the opportunities each site offers. So for example, at Ordnance Lane, this is a view of terraced houses, back gardens onto a shared, I wouldn't call it a ginnel, I'd say it's much more of a communal garden, because the site lends itself to, in this case, much wider separation between the terraces. But many of the same ideas like communal growing and an emphasis on easy children's play, which is well overlooked and secure, as the kind of catalyst for growing communities. And that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was wonderful. If you're happy to turn your screen sharing off, we'll bring people back into
Sure.
space.
I can find out.
Work out how to do it.
Stop share.
Yes, we're there.
Yes.
Nicely done. Right. Thank you both. That was really interesting. I've certainly got questions, but I'd like to kind of open it up to everybody else first. So do we have questions? Anybody like to stick their hand up and start things moving? Jeff?
I see Peggy's raising her hand.
All right. Okay.
Yes, thanks. Beautiful architecture, lovely defensible space. I once had a chat with Oscar Newman. And it's good to see you're trying to address the embodied carbon, which I don't think Passive House does it? But having cars on your schemes, or on your client schemes, I suppose, means the residents have got high carbon footprints. The Derwenthorpe residents were measured by the University of York as over 14 tonnes a year of carbon dioxide per resident on average. The only ones with significantly lower than that were the ones that didn't live in motorist households. And that sort of emission trashes any carbon footprint. And did your schemes have any thought of providing local services so people could walk to them? I suppose they weren't necessarily big enough schemes to do that, but a few shops in would mean that people needn't get into their car. But
can I answer that?
Yeah, let's just get a response to that.
Thank you. That is a great question, and one we grapple with every project. So we on Norwich, our local authority and client undertook a needs survey of their residents and discovered that they could push back on the expectations of the local plan, which called for 1-to-1 car parking, and negotiated a 0.7 ratio of car parking to residents, which felt like a victory. There's also a desire for a car club, which hasn't come forward because there hasn't been any uptake by a local car club provider. I think, however, the scheme in Norwich is in a sweet spot because it's 10 minutes walk away and shops are at the bottom of the green space. So it's very well provided. And I know a lot of residents don't have cars. However, as architects, there's only so much we can do. So if, as for example, we're working in a West Somerset village at the moment, where, you know, we're trying to push back on the numbers of cars and the huge power and authority of the highways engineer in the local planning process. And it's a massive battle. You know, our client would like to have less cars, but the local residents want more cars. So how do we deal with this? You know, we need, I think what your question is kind of suggesting is that this is all pissing in the wind. And I think to some level, on some level, that would be right, until we have a joined up policy from government about making sure that we emulate what they've done in the best bits of Europe, which is to prioritize great public transport and to disincentivize developments which are car reliant. So, Jeff, I'm fully behind that. Whenever we talk about new housing, we try and talk about the kind of slightly binary opposition between making great places and the car. I don't think it's just about low carbon. I think it's also about the sense of safety and community and connectedness that less car use gives.
Great,
So,
thank you for that, David.
yeah.
Can I just shift on to a next question? Peggy, I think I missed you last time, so apologies.
Well, that's fine. This isn't really a question. This is a thank you. My name is actually Margaret, and I'm the younger sister of Philip. And I just wanted to thank everybody for dedicating this session to my late brother. And I'm just a pleasure for me to join you. Thank you for the invitation, and greetings from Canada. It's very much a cold prairie winter and a car-centric city, which makes life, well, actually when it's really -20 or so, it's very valuable to have a car. So it's all very different, but I just wanted to say thank you for this opportunity to participate with you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Peggy. That's much appreciated. There's a question in the chat box from Ivana about, I'm surprised to hear about gas flues in a passive house. This would be Goldsmith Street. Do the Norwich houses need much heating at all? So David, one for you.
Yeah, so the gas heating, well, they don't need much heating at all. There's only one radiator in each house. And even that was not, we weren't, our design team weren't entirely sure we'd need it, but the client is a local authority. And at that time when the decision was made, it would have been much cheaper to go fully electric in terms of capital cost. But this was 100% socially rented, and our client took the decision that it would not be appropriate to remove the choice of people being able to use gas for their heating, because at the time it was so much cheaper than electricity. And at the time also it had, there was no real carbon benefit to using electricity. So interesting that you will make that point, and we're not doing any schemes now with gas.
Right, interesting, thank you. There any other questions we've got from people who are in the room and want to stick a hand up? There is another written question down here. Have either or both of you got hints for a group of us in York that have ambitions to establish co-owned housing and neighbourhood? We have a site in mind, she says, mysterious Penny.
I can answer that, Phil, I think. The people you need to talk to are the Lancaster Co-Housing Group, because they have created an absolutely amazing scheme. And if you go to the link on the Better Buildings book that I mentioned, that has passive house design. It's been subject to lots of post-occupancy testing by both Sheffield University and Leeds Beckett. And the people who ran it, when I went to meet them to write about them, were just extraordinary. And very, very keen to share their experiences. So they run open days, and you get a tour around the scheme. And if you're lucky, it coincides with a lunch or an evening meal, and you get to share with that as well. So that would definitely be, I think, a better starting place than some of the London ones, which have kind of very unique circumstances behind their sort of creation, really. But the Lancaster one was absolutely, we're a group of mates, we want to do this. How do we find the land? Where do we get the land? How do we finance it? How do we get to build it? All of those decisions right from the very, very beginning. So it's Lancaster Co-Housing.
That's great, thank you. I'm conscious of the fact that we're at an hour and a half now. I'm happy to run on a bit if both of our main speakers are happy to run on a little bit and pick up any further questions. Great, that's got a thumbs up there. Any further questions then? There's a couple in the chat box. One is one of those questions that gets us architects kind of flapping our arms around, which is the straightforward one of, are all your windows washable from the inside? Come on, folks.
Of course
Come on.
they are.
Ah,
Of course
okay.
they are.
Yeah, the inside's definitely washable from the inside on ours.
Yes, nicely put, but yeah, I
No,
guess
no,
with the
they're all
advent
by,
of tilt and turn windows, then
no, they're
yes.
all tilt and turn. They're all
Yeah.
by they're all triple glazed by a company called Ideal Combi, who do a lovely product, and they're all washable from the inside.
Great stuff. Thank you. And there's another question down here. Would you be able to say a bit more about ventilation systems that were used? Either of you, really?
Well, we started on phase 1 with mechanical vent and heat recovery. And the reason for choosing that was really on health grounds. So if you make a really airtight home and you insulate it really well, and you do everything you can to keep out, infiltration, heat losses, then you need to have a ventilation system that's quite controlled. And interestingly, because we had what was deemed to be a zero carbon fuel, NVHR actually sent the energy model the wrong way. So it was using more carbon, not energy, carbon, than the scheme would have done without it, because you were basically recovering heat that had no carbon content, according to the energy model. And obviously that's the government's SAP model, which is a bit tricky. We had, because, and David mentioned it, clay fields as well, the problem when you're pioneering is that you're often in an environment where there isn't the expertise or the support or the technical knowledge or technical capacity. And we had a real struggle on the large houses to get a ventilation system that was quiet enough. So it met the flow rate criteria. In other words, it was providing enough fresh air. And it also managed the efficiencies on the heat recovery, but it wasn't quiet enough. And we backed away from that on the later phases, partly because of this problem we had on the whole scheme of trying to ensure that the scheme was affordable. So, even in the privately owned homes, trying to keep them at an affordable level. And we then went to a continuous mechanical extract system, which works in the same way as NVHR, but without heat recovery. So it's bringing fresh air in mechanically, ensuring you have the background levels. I think that NVHR is becoming much more understood by both suppliers and contractors. But David mentioned, for instance, the Green Building Store and Paul. You don't have the same conversation when you speak to a mainstream ventilation company who has bought in a European NVHR unit and rebadged it with some eco label. So it's something that needs to be done with a lot of thought and a lot of consideration. And the experience at Lancaster Co-Housing, who also a pioneering group, was that they did manage to get a scheme that worked very well, but all of the support was in German. So when they had software upgrades, they really struggled. And they had some lifestyle changes that they weren't expecting. So for instance, constant smoking and using tea lights meant that you were replacing filters regularly. So it's definitely the future, because why would you not preheat incoming fresh air with a fairly simple system, but it brings with it a kind of slightly some challenges with the installation and management, and some challenges just with technical understanding.
Great, thank you for that. There's a question on a different theme in the chat box from Believe, which is, do you know if there are any plans to support community growing as residents move in? I'm guessing that's aimed mainly at David for the York schemes.
Hi. Yes, there are plans for community growing in all of the schemes. I'm sorry, I don't have the details for how joined up that is with future maintenance, but there is provision. Certainly, one of the main themes of our brief has been about, landscape brief has been about future opportunities for communal growing. So yes, and I know we're talking to Edible York and others about helping us with that.
Great stuff, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay. This is the joys of Zoom. I'd just like to find a question I've got, which is that in many ways, what the two schemes that you've described is about, I think both of them have now disappeared, which makes asking a question slightly difficult. Oh no, it doesn't. Richard's still there. About moving outside the four walls of the housing. And I think one of the things that we spent a lot of time about back in the 60s and 70s probably was thinking about housing design within the four walls, but both of for both of you, the schemes that you've described, a lot of the joy of them really is about how you've created space and how you've created place outside. Is that something that you both feel is becoming increasingly important and brings new challenges as you start to deal with urban sites?
Just very briefly, I mean, it's the kind of tyranny of developer private housing, provided housing, is that actually they actively exclude anything that is shared or communal. Anything that you can't put a red line around and say that's your demise, that's what we're selling you, is a liability for them. And of course, the house building financial model assumes that they leave the scheme as early as they can. The more that's sold off plan and the sooner they can get out of it and get out of providing any landscape at all, the better, because they're not investing in the kind of long-term future of the community.
Yeah.
It's not how the business works.
Yeah.
So I think what characterizes both of David's schemes and our Derwenthorpe scheme is that actually there's some element of guardianship and custodianship from an organization that expects you to buy into it to a certain extent as well. So I imagine there's a residents association that you pay a subscription to, or you pay a standing charge to, and that mechanism is what's needed, and it never exists in private housing. The last time that happened is sort of span housing in the 1960s. Probably.
I'd just like to say, Richard, that is so true. We have just lost a competition for exactly that reason. We did a really lovely scheme for a project in Manchester, and we were naive enough to think that a private developer would, because they made all the right noises initially, would consider a scheme with shared space. At the end of the day, no way.
And it's such a shame because there were mechanisms. So we did some research on English partnerships around and a kind of idea of a sustainable suburbia, in which we resurrected some of the ideas from span housing about having a really strong residents association and most of the landscape being communal, not private.
Yeah.
And everybody benefiting, because the defining characteristic of the span houses is actually it's the landscape. The houses are all very similar and very repetitive, but everybody's house value is the same because the landscapes are great. So it's kind of disappeared from our culture, which I think is absolutely tragic. And the best thing about the sort of schemes that David and I have been involved in is that you actually get a real sense of kind of joy going around them, because people are out and about and using space and meeting each other. And that's the kind of neighborliness that we've totally lost in the sort of car-based private model, of those aerial views that David showed of suburbia.
On that note, I don't know if anybody knows in the audience, but I was drawn to a bit of research which has been published by the NHBC called Making Spaces for Play.
Yeah.
I'm sure a number of you will know about it. And the big takeaway from that research across 5 or 6 different projects, which was studied over 3 or 4 days around the country, was the huge divergence in the number of minutes or hours of people in the public realm varied so enormously between each scheme, and the level also of reported satisfaction with the places people lived, was directly related to how much time they spent out. And that seemed to have a lot to do with children playing. And children aren't accounted for. That scheme I showed at the beginning, the typical edge of town scheme, which is all tarmac, cars, there's nowhere for children to play. There's nothing.
So
if there is, it's a derisory little play space with a springy chicken in the corner.
So the key to that is, as you talked about the custodianship, it's either a local authority who have bought into it, it's a social housing provider or a body like Joseph Rowntree Housing Trust, or you're looking at community-led schemes, the sort of thing that Lancaster have done, the sort of thing that Penny was talking about in terms of what's being thought about in York. They seem to be key elements of that then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
that's really interesting. One question here, and I think probably wind up shortly after that. What I will do with all the questions in the chat box, if there are any that are specific to each of the speakers, I'll fire them on to them and get them to see if we can get answers. And if for all of you who've put links into the chat box, that's really great. I'll make sure the chat text gets circulated out with a follow-up email at some point. But just the last question on here, which is, in either projects, was there consideration to use a green roof? And if not, why not?
Well, we shot ourselves in the foot by evoking this kind of romantic tradition of medieval roofscapes and really steeply pitched roofs. So
You could get a goat up there.
yeah. We always have a conflict on urban schemes between, there's always this fight between, is it green roof, is it renewables, or is it place-based? And it's interesting how the first two are very high in the kind of decision-making kind of priorities of local authorities, but it always actually ends up that the green roof is the one that gets kind of designed out for some reason.
I've got some experience with green roofs.
You've obviously taken the roofs very seriously on the stuff you're doing in York, David, so it'd be interesting to hear what your take on that is.
I don't know if you still remember the church walk scheme I showed. We had wildflower roofs on all the flat areas of roof, and I love the idea of green roofs and wildflower roofs. I love the idea of bringing back biodiversity into new builds, insects, bees, birds, etc. Love it. I love the idea also of a green roof insulating the roof naturally with the soil and the build-up. For a long time, Goldsmith Street had a green roof on that low-pitched kind of north-facing side. And we kind of lost faith in it after I had a leak at Church Walk and realized that actually trying to find the leak under a green roof is an absolute nightmare. You end up having to take the whole lot off. And if you're lucky, you'll find the leak, and then you put it all back again, and that is no mean feat. So that could have been because it was a wildflower, which has more substrate than a sedum roof, which is much shallower. But I was slightly put off by that experience.
I understand that. Yes, speaking as a man with a green roof over my head here, I would hate to think of ever rummage around in that. So yes.
But also there was a sense that they're very hard to maintain well. It's bad enough getting a footpath maintained. Never mind sending somebody up to kind of take out one of those huge buddleias that suddenly starts growing on a green roof because a bird's dropped a seed up there. It's not as straightforward or as magical as it might seem from the outside. It looks very alluring. I've done loads of green roofs in private projects over many years, and we felt on balance that green roof for a massive scheme like Norwich just wasn't going to fly. Just because of the maintenance issues, because of the risks associated with leakage. Not that it's any more likely to leak than any other roof, but if it does, then what?
Yeah.
So, there are various reasons why we didn't pursue it, I'm afraid.
It's a straightforward message, which is anything you put up on top needs maintenance. So clearly Richard and I have kind of worked our way out of that one, and David, you're still taking some chances. So it's good to see all options being explored. I think we should wind up now. We're losing people gradually as people have to go. I'd like to say a really big thank you to Richard and to David for being here this evening and for speaking, and both showing wonderful presentations, really, really interesting stuff. And I think as an event which does look at where we were in 2013 with the Housing Design Awards and the enthusiasm that Philip Crowe put into bringing the panels up here and giving us a chance to look at them, it's great to see how two of the architects involved with two of those schemes are really moving forward, carrying their ideas forward, and doing interesting stuff now, and doing it in York, which is brilliant. So thank you both. Thank you everyone for coming along this evening. The event will be recorded, has been recorded, will be up on our YouTube channel, and I'll do a follow-up email to everybody who came along tonight to make sure that you know where to look for it. So many thanks, folks. And if you still have gaps in your social diary later this week, then there are loads of other things on as part of York Environment Week. Do take a look at yorkenvironmentweek.org.uk. and do book. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.